I was looking at some material over this lectionary reading, these lectionary readings today, and John van der Laar, who has authored some of the liturgies we use at the 9:30, he suggests that in the last year he's encountered quite a few memes about the actor, Keanu Reeves. And apparently he's a man who's been through a long list of tragedies and difficulties in his life, but remarkably hasn't allowed them to make him bitter. And these memes, by the way, memes is just a short excerpt of video or text or a picture embellished to illustrate something on the web. I'm sure you've seen it many times, sometimes very irritating. But anyway, some of these memes also describe his amazing generosity, his contributions to charitable causes, and apparently in the making of the films, the Matrix trilogy, I'm sure many of you have seen them, he has given bonuses to those on the staff who make those films. So John van der Laar felt this sounded all a bit suspicious. How could anyone be so saintly? He did a little digging. And as far as he could find, all these stories are true. And he is just a kind, a down-to-earth, unembittered, generous kind of a guy. And the fact that the story has touched so many lives across the world reveals the profound impact that compassion and small acts of kindness to others can have. As he himself, Keanu Reeves, is reported to have said, if you've been brutally broken, but still have the courage to be gentle to other living beings, then you're a badass with the heart of an angel. I'm not sure if you're allowed to use the word badass at 7:30, but anyway, you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. You're a badass with the heart of an angel. So I want to suggest that those who, like Keanu Reeves, and a long list of others, St. Francis included, who choose to live with compassion automatically build bridges between themselves and others. And I think in many ways our life is about building bridges in a world where we're increasingly isolated from one another. Why? Because they demonstrate how simple acts of compassion can connect us and help us to make the world as a whole compassionate. And in a real sense, they're reflecting the essence of Jesus' teaching about the reign of God. So as we seek to follow Christ and become bridge builders in this world of ours, refusing to remain isolated from one another, we too are called to embrace Jesus' way of compassion. And of course, many of you, I can see a surgeon or two here, have been called to that. It's a ministry for you, just as teachers and others obviously may be. But all of us, in one sense or another, whether we're a businessman or a professional person, can reach out to others with compassion. And for many of us, I think our workplace is the place where we practice our spiritual walk with Jesus in compassion. But of course, one of the biggest challenges to living with compassion is that often we just don't see very well. Our lives are surrounded by invisible people, those who fill our world, who we kind of ignore. Sometimes it's hard to ignore them when they present you with a bouquet of flowers at the robot, clearly asking for some money, reminding you that they're hungry. Or the irritating person on the cash register at the supermarket who's taking so long to get through your stuff. These become invisible to us. And why? Because in a real sense, we can't cope emotionally with all of the hurt we see in the people around us all the time. And we'd burn ourselves out quickly if we tried to respond to all of that immediately with every part of our emotion. We call this compassion fatigue. And even fatigue can overwhelm even the kindest and the most selfless of us. But that doesn't mean that we must stop being kind and considerate. Other than, of course, to friends and family, we assume that. But to others as well. We just need to see things a little differently. And I think Jesus illustrates it for us in the gospel today, Matthew 9:35. Jesus says that, we read that Jesus had compassion on the crowds who were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus saw their pain and suffering and was moved to act with compassion. We, of course, often just turn a blind eye to that. But Jesus calls us with him into those acts of compassion. We don't build a better world or a better life by closing our hearts to the needs around us. And Jesus' example challenges us to see more clearly, to see not just the suffering, but the humanity and the dignity of those who suffer. And I found that quite a lot. We have a feeding scheme. We used to feed about 85 to 100 before COVID. For some reason, the numbers have dropped. I think people were scattered, perhaps to their homes. We only feed about 65. Conversations that I've started up with some of those guys, one or two or three in particular, and you learn that this is a professional man, and he comes from the Congo, and he has a family, and he has a history, and he has a dignity. And no longer are we blind to who they are. So I don't know about you, but most of the churches I've belonged to have had ministries of compassion. So we have the feeding scheme. I think that's amazing. When I first arrived here, and for the first 3 or 4 years here, some of the ladies in the parish were running a feeding scheme to 400 primary school kids from 4 different schools in Alex. And I know with Lawrence and I went out there a couple of times, and they ran this amazingly for a long while. For a variety of reasons, they weren't able to continue it. And so we have those ministries of compassion, but we can't always leave it to somebody else. I don't know what your experience is. You imagine, well, the pastor must have more of that than us. I know when I was in each of the churches I've been in Bez Valley, for example, we had a home, 3-story block of flats, and a home for 21 alcoholics and drug addicts. And another block of flats where the staff used to live, and then a house where we used to minister, called Bethany. We used to minister to 15 women and their children who had come out of battered and abusive situations. Subsequently, they've sold off the ministry to the alcoholics and drug addicts. But under Biddy Edwards, Dave Edwards' wife, it's now grown from 15 women and children to 50 women and children. They've moved into the 3-story block of flats. And what an amazing ministry that is. And so each of the parishes I've been in, there's a calling, just as I think our calling is to that feeding scheme. We need to support it. It's a key part of our ministry. But each one of us must surely encounter people. My own experience is that in every parish I've been in, every place I've lived in, there have been between 5 and 7 people who I've begun to have contact with on a long-term basis. And I can almost see all of them in my mind's eye. I remember one, I think I've mentioned to you before, his name in my last parish, we called him the Pope, and he was a little man in a heavy black jacket that made him twice his size. And in the middle of the sermon like this, I'd be talking, he would suddenly get up and walk down. We'd all kind of be watching him nervously, and he'd go and he'd kneel there and pray through the rest of the sermon. And then he used to write these long letters with very flowery language to the President of South Africa, Prime Minister, President, King. He used to write long stories. Obviously quite an intelligent guy. And he'd live outside. You know that Google capture, if you wrote an address down, 36 David Street, and you arrive, if you look at it online, there's a picture of the property. So I just happened to look at our church property one day, and who should be in the picture of the property but the Pope in his black coat, opening his lunch and having a meal. And I think I have told some of you, sorry to bore you again, the day that I drove up, someone and the kids drove in another car. I drove up Charlie in my car. And about 100 k's out of East London, I saw this guy walking down the road, and it was the Pope. He didn't have his black coat on. I said, "What are you doing here?" I said, he said, "No, he'd left East London 3 days ago." This was at the 100k mark. I said, "You walked 30 k's a day?" "Yes." "And what are you eating?" I said, living off the land. And so I put him in the car. He's heading for Cape Town. We were heading for Joburg and Queenstown. I said, no, this is the wrong direction. Didn't matter. No, that's Cape Town. Anyway, we stopped at Queenstown, and I got him some breakfast, and I gave him some money, and I've never seen him again. And those people start to have a tug on you, don't they? Because they have a dignity and a purpose for themselves. Who knows some of the horrors that he dealt with? He shared a little of them, of his life in Cape Town where he was born. And I know that each of us is called to share something of those people's lives. I was in the Garden of Remembrance the first day of COVID. You know, all that build-up, lockdown, you must be in your place, you must be in your homes, you're not allowed to wander around anymore. And I met a young lady called Linda. Actually, turned out she wasn't so young. Her mother had died. She didn't have any other family. She didn't have a job. She didn't have a place to stay. She was well-spoken. And the long and the short of it is we worked out she didn't have a place to stay. But we had our quarters in the back of our garden that were uninhabited at the moment. So I said, well, come and stay. I got Simon's permission. We moved her in there. She stayed there for 6 months through all the hard lockdowns. And then when we had to move a member of staff in there because she also was in a tricky COVID situation. You know, a lot of people live in maybe 20, 30 people in a 4-room block of room flat. They divide the rooms into quarters with blankets, and a whole lot of the people in her room were dying of COVID, or had COVID, and were coughing. We had to get out of there. So we put her there, and at the time we were cleaning up the backstage area, and we discovered there's a completely cleared out a room, quite independently of all this, which had 2 toilets and running water and lights. It didn't have, So with the kind permission of council, we moved her into there for a while. And theoretically, it was only meant to be for a short while. I've got into a little bit of trouble with council recently when they discovered that she's still there. She's like the church mouse. Nobody ever sees her. She slips in and out. We try to get her to come to church. She now runs a bookshop 5 days a week in 4th Avenue. You can pop in and meet her. But she does still not quite earning enough money. I know there was a time when I advertised this fact, and I said, is there not someone who's got a back room, servants' quarters or whatever, we could move her into? I suppose in a way I'm making a plea again. But I think those are acts of compassion. Those are the people we're called to help somehow. You might say to me, oh, but what about all the other people? Yes, what about all the other people? If this Good Samaritan was walking down the road to Jericho, wherever it was he was going, and he saw the guy lying in the gutter, he could easily, by the way, the priest and the lay minister said, oh, well, there are lots of people like him. I can't help him. What nonsense. That is the person God has placed in your path today. Serve them, help them. And you better stop me, because I could go on to a list of about 25 people with each with their story. Some of them don't work out so well. And sometimes, one can overextend oneself and lose track. Because I think God wants us to be sensible too. And we've got to be practical. We've got to make a plan for Linda. Maybe you can help me do that. But she's a wonderful person who needs our help. And so we reach out to her and others. So you see, because the next step in the story of compassion is we need to act on it. In Matthew 10, soon after that first passage where we hear about him having compassion, we read that Jesus called to him his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out, to heal every disease and every affliction. What did he do in response? Well, we know what he did. He healed a whole lot of these folk. He ministered to them. But then he sent the disciples out and expanded the ministry. And we are an extension of those disciples today. We are the people Jesus has sent out. So this isn't just a happy-go-lucky silent meditation once a week, maybe with a bit of singing added. It's the place where we receive our marching orders. Go out. You get your life back in the bread and the wine when you come up and receive in communion, consecrated, empowered with the Spirit, and you go out into the world and you do those things that Jesus said. You've got authority over the evil in the world around you. You've got to stand up. We might not call them evil spirits anymore, but I mean, they're just as real. You only have to look at what's going on in the world today. In the Ukraine, in Russia, the Sudan, South Africa. People for greed will do anything to grab their million and run so they can have their fancy flat in London and go visit all the stars in Monte Carlo and what have you. You're seeing it today happening in our country and in our own lives. Jesus didn't just see with compassion. He didn't just feel sorry, oh shame for them. When possible, he actively allowed what he saw to drive him to heal and to comfort and restore and make whole. So, we've heard the saying, oh, well, love is not just a feeling, it's an act of the will. Well, I want to say that compassion is not just a feeling. It is a decision to do something about it. Compassion, it's not good enough just to say, oh, shame. It's not compassion then. Compassion is when you do something about it. Jesus immediately said, go, heal every disease and every affliction, cast the demons out, confront the evil powers. And so, realistically, on a global level, we can't really do much. We hear a lot of talk about global warming. But that young woman from Scandinavia who's become a meme, you just look at her face and oh, she's a bit older now. She's going into her 20s. But she's devoted her whole life to travel around the world, confronting people with the realities of global warming. And each of us in our own small way can do what we can. Do you think that's an object of compassion? Yes, because global warming is going to start ruining the lives of people all over the world. Already the glaciers in South America are drying up, and people who live in mountain villages don't have enough water anymore. It's become an issue. Get my drift. We can be educated about the injustices in our world. We can't just say, oh, well, that's happening over there like we used to in apartheid. Oh, yes, all those people over there, we didn't see them. Now you tell us that they were all herded into places, their land stole from them, and their town nothing to do with us. No. One of my earliest memories as a 4-year-old was a bunch of old black men who'd come to my dad in Ermelo, where we lived, and I was taken along for the ride. And we went into this area where there were a whole lot of old huts, and all the roofs had gone. And these guys had been forced out of where they lived, but all the steel, metal had been stolen. My dad took the case to the court, to the police station. So one of my earliest memories is reaching out to people who were in need, the victims of society, in that case of apartheid, and doing something practical about it. So if we want to create a compassionate world, in a world where, let's face it, people are becoming less compassionate, more polarized, more defensive. You only have to go on the net. I think the net has made it easier. People don't just share thoughts and they say, well, I'm not sure that I agree with you. What about so-and-so? They say, you idiot, how can you say that? You're useless. If I saw you in the face today, I'd hit you. That's the kind of thing we see going on now, which is really peculiar. But that isn't the world that we want. And we all long for a world of peace, of justice, of sustainability and sufficiency for all. And it's also not enough for us just to complain about what's going on in society. Join a political party. Join a march. Do something. Write a letter. Let's be a part of this new movement in a world where we're trying to change what we see in the hurts of those around us. And sometimes that can leave us feeling cynical, believing that our actions do nothing. But that's not the truth. The truth is that millions of small acts of kindness do make a difference, and they create the world we have. And fortunately, we see a lot of that in our society too. And the way we've been brought up, and the way we love one another, our families have nurtured us. In Matthew 10:7-8, just a few sentences later from that initial commission, he says, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out the demons. So he's repeating some of his earlier stuff, but he's given it a few new ones. I've shared with you that comment about St. Francis of Assisi, who is reputed to have people contest this, but it sounds like him. He's reputed to have said, go and preach the good news, and when necessary, use words. In other words, preach the good news is not necessarily first up about using your mouth. It's about reaching down and helping the guy on the side of the road who's really hurt, helping those in your immediate circle. And this becomes a wave of goodwill and kindness that begins to build and change the world around us. And so as Christ following bridge builders, we are called to work towards this transformational vision. We must seek to create communities that are rooted in love and justice and compassion. For many of you, that's in your workplace. We must work towards systemic change that addresses the roots, causes of others' suffering and inequality, and do so with the knowledge that this work is ongoing and evolutionary. It's going to take a while. This is not going to happen for centuries, but we still live as though it can happen tomorrow. It's no good just saying, oh, well, nothing's going to happen now. Let's just eat, drink, and be merry, which unfortunately is what a lot of people do. But we can't do that. Why? Because Jesus is our master, and we follow him in his footsteps. How did he live? He was an astonishing person. It's not actually so much about belief and doctrine and churches and buildings. It's about following the footsteps of the master. As Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Amen. Let us pray.